My son sold my late wife's grandfather clock to take his wife to Paris. The repairman called me. 8:59 a.m. For 40 years, Richard had waited for this sound, the chiming of his grandfather's clock, the heart of the house. But today, there was only dead silence. He stepped out into the hallway and froze. Where the clock had stood, there was only a pale patch of wall, a ghostly scar. Trembling, he dialed his son's number, sensing something terrible. Thomas. The clock. Where is it? His voice was hoarse. There was the sound of chewing and frustration on the other end of the line. I sold it. You called me just in time for an important lunch. Sold it? I can't do that. It was my grandfather's, a keepsake from my mother. Dad, be realistic. Thomas sighed. Isabel needs money to go to Paris. She's just a noisy old block of wood. Forget it. My oysters are here. Beep, beep. I guess 99% of you will hear this. Sigh and scroll past, not clicking like or subscribe, even if it only takes a second. What time is it for you, and where are you listening? The morning sun, thin and pale as it so often was over Beacon Hill in October, filtered through the leaded glass of Richard's study. It was a room of quiet dignity, smelling faintly of old paper, leather, and pipe tobacco, though Richard hadn't smoked his pipe in years. He sat in his worn armchair, the Boston Globe resting on his lap, a half-finished cup of Earl Grey cooling on the coaster beside him. He wasn't reading, not really. He was listening, waiting. It was 8:58 a.m. For 40 years, his life had been set to the rhythm of the Howard Miller grandfather clock that stood sentinel in the upstairs hallway. It was more than a timekeeper. It was the house's heartbeat. Its deep, resonant chime at the top of the hour was the punctuation mark to his days, a steady, reliable companion. The gentle, rhythmic ticking was the house breathing. He had inherited it from his father, who had inherited it from his. A magnificent piece of craftsmanship from an era when things were built to last, a testament to a time of substance and permanence. He glanced at his wristwatch. 8:59. Any second now. The familiar, preparatory whirring, the click of the gears engaging, and then the first, sonorous peal of the Westminster quarters. It was a sound that had cradled his son Thomas as a baby, a sound that had rung out on his wedding day to Clara, a sound that had marked the solemn silence after her passing. The second hand on his watch swept past the 12. Silence. Not just an absence of sound, but a profound, deafening void. The silence pressed in on him, heavy and unnatural. It was as if the world had suddenly gone mute. Richard's brow furrowed. Had he forgotten to wind it? Unlikely. Winding the clock was a Sunday evening ritual as sacred as the crossword puzzle. He'd done it just 3 days ago, the heavy brass weights ascending with a satisfying groan. Perhaps the mechanism had finally, after all these years, given up. A spring snapped, a gear stripped, an understandable, if melancholy, end. He pushed himself up from the armchair, his joints protesting with a soft creak. He walked out of the study, the familiar floorboards groaning under his weight, each step usually accompanied by the steady tick-tock from the hall. Now, there was only the sound of his own soft footsteps, an alien and lonely rhythm in the sudden stillness. He reached the top of the stairs and turned, and stopped. His heart did not so much stop as seize, a painful, violent clench in his chest. He stared at the empty space against the wall. It wasn't just empty, it was violated. A ghostly outline, a perfect rectangle of darker, richer wallpaper, framed a shockingly pale square where the clock had stood for 4 decades, shielding the paper from the bleaching effect of the afternoon Sunday. On the polished hardwood floor, 4 faint indentations marked where its feet had rested, like the fossilized footprints of some extinct, noble beast. The silence in the house was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a presence, a haunting, screaming void that spoke of theft and violation. His home, his fortress of solitude and memory, had been breached. Its very heart had been ripped out. He fumbled for his phone, his hands trembling with a sudden, cold fury. There was only one person. It couldn't be. And yet he knew with a certainty that was as sickening as it was absolute. He found Thomas's number and pressed the call button. It rang twice before being answered, not with a hello, but with the clatter of silverware against porcelain and a backdrop of loud, self-important chatter. What is it, Dad? You called just in time for an important lunch? Thomas's voice was sharp, annoyed, laced with the easy arrogance of the new Boston elite. Through the phone, Richard could hear the distinct clinking of wine glasses and the braying laughter of the city's movers and shakers. Thomas was in his natural habitat, a fine dining temple in the Seaport district, a world of glass and steel and fleeting trends, a world built on the liquidation of the past. Richard's own voice was a hoarse whisper, the words catching in his throat. Thomas, I'm standing in the hallway. The clock. Where is it? There was a pause, a sound of someone chewing, a wet, unpleasant noise that made Richard's stomach turn. I sold it. The words were so simple, so brutally direct. They hung in the air between the quiet, violated hallway on Beacon Hill and the noisy, glittering restaurant in the Seaport. Sold it? Richard repeated, the word tasting like ash. You can't do that. It's your grandfather's. It was for Clara. A long, impatient sigh came down the line. Dad, be realistic. It's a huge, noisy block of wood. It doesn't even fit the minimalist style of today. Isabel wants to go to Paris for some exclusive culinary event. It's a fantastic networking opportunity, great for her brand. Isabel, of course, the influencer, a woman who curated her life for an audience of strangers, who valued everything by its aesthetic and brand value rather than its soul. To her, the clock would have been an anachronism, an embarrassing relic. My oysters are here, Thomas said, his tone final, dismissive. Look, it's just an old block of wood. Get over it. The line went dead. Get over it. The phrase echoed in the cavernous silence of the hallway. 40 years of history, of family, of love and loss, dismissed in 3 callous words. Thomas hadn't just sold an antique. He had liquidated his heritage. He had taken the symbol of their family's endurance, the repository of its memories, and converted it into cash for a trip to Paris and some oysters. Richard thought of last Tuesday. He'd been at the Boston Athenaeum giving his weekly lecture on colonial silversmiths, Thomas had called. Dad, I'm just going to pop by and pick up some of those old steamer trunks from the cellar for storage, he'd said. Save you the trouble. His trust had been the key Thomas used to enter and plunder his home. Richard lowered the phone, his hand falling limply to his side. He looked at the wall again. The light from the landing window fell directly on the pale rectangle of wallpaper, illuminating the ghost of what had been. It wasn't just a gap, it was a scar, a declaration that the past was erased, that memory was worthless, that the steady, comforting heartbeat of his life had been silenced for good. And in its place, a bitter, helpless emptiness began to grow. The days that followed were lived in a muted haze. The silence in the house was a physical entity, a thick, suffocating blanket that smothered all other sounds. Richard found himself taking the narrow back staircase meant for servants, just to avoid the top of the main landing. He'd walk past the hallway entrance quickly, his eyes fixed straight ahead, as if a sideways glance might cause the wound on the wall to start bleeding. He'd sit in his study, the newspaper unread, the tea untouched, listening to the phantom ticking that echoed only in his memory. The house, once his sanctuary, now felt like a tomb. Its heart had been ripped out, and Richard, its lonely occupant, was just a ghost haunting its silent corridors. He ate standing up in the kitchen, tasteless sandwiches and cold cereal, unable to bear the formal quiet of the dining room. Sleep was a shallow, restless affair, punctuated by dreams of a clock chiming in a distant, unreachable room. He nurtured a fragile, foolish hope that Thomas might call. Not to apologize, he knew his son better than that, but perhaps to offer some flimsy, face-saving excuse, a lie he could almost pretend to believe, but his phone remained as silent as the house. On the 4th day, as he was rinsing his coffee cup in the sink, the phone rang. The sound was so jarring in the stillness that he physically flinched, dropping the cup with a clatter. It didn't break. A small miracle. He stared at the phone as it buzzed on the granite countertop. An unknown number, with a local area code. For a wild, irrational second, his heart leaped. Thomas, using a different phone, perhaps. He wiped his damp hands on his trousers and answered, his voice a dry croak. Hello? Good morning. I'm trying to reach a Mr. Finch? The voice on the other end was slow, deliberate, with a soft, rolling burr that spoke of the Scottish Highlands. Richard cleared his throat. This is Richard Finch. Ah, splendid. My name is Alistair Finch. Richard frowned. The name was a strange, disorienting echo. I'm sorry, are we related? A low chuckle came through the line. I don't believe so, sir. It seems to be just a fine coincidence. I'm a horologist, a clockmaker. I have a small repair shop in the North End. The reason I'm calling, I have something here that I believe belongs to your family. A Howard Miller grandfather clock. Your son sold it to me yesterday. Richard sank onto a kitchen stool, the world tilting slightly on its axis. He said nothing, simply gripping the edge of the counter. Alistair Finch seemed to understand. He didn't rush the silence, letting it hang for a moment before continuing, his voice gentle but firm. It's a magnificent piece, sir, a true work of art. It looked like it had been well cared for over the years, he paused. But the lad, your son, he didn't seem to care about any of that. He just wanted to know how much cash he could get for it. Said he needed to solve a problem. I've seen his type before. They come in here with their inheritance under their arm, selling off their history without blinking an eye. The words, spoken by this calm, methodical stranger, landed with more force than Thomas's own callous dismissal. It was a clinical, unbiased diagnosis of his son's character, and it confirmed every terrible fear Richard held. He had raised a man who saw heritage as a burden and history as a currency. Mr. Finch? Are you still there, sir? Yes, Richard managed, his voice barely audible. Yes, I'm here. There's another reason I called, Alistair said, his tone shifting, becoming more focused, more urgent. It's not my practice to get involved in family matters, but this felt different. Sir, when I was conducting my initial inspection of the mechanism, I found something cleverly hidden. It was tucked away in a small, lead-lined cavity right behind the pendulum assembly. It seems your wife left something behind. Richard's breath caught in his chest. Clara? It's a small, sealed leather pouch, Alistair continued. Her name, Clara, is embossed on it. I haven't opened it, of course. It's not my place. But it was clearly meant to be found by someone who knew what they were looking for, or by a craftsman who took the time to look closely. Your son was in such a hurry he wouldn't have noticed a thing. Sir, I think you need to come right away. The fog of helplessness that had enveloped Richard for days began to dissipate, burned away by a sudden, intense heat. A purpose, a mystery, a message from Clara, reaching out to him from across the years. The crushing weight of the loss was suddenly replaced by a glimmer of hope, a fierce, burning curiosity. The clock was no longer just a stolen artifact. It was a vessel, a time capsule. I'll be there, Richard said, his voice now clear and strong. He took down the address, a small cobblestone street in the historic North End, a world away from the gleaming towers of the seaport. He didn't hesitate. He hung up the phone, walked directly to the front hall closet, and put on his tweed overcoat. He grabbed his keys from the bowl on the hall table, his movements swift and decisive. For the first time in 4 days, he had a reason to leave the house. As he reached for the front door, his gaze fell upon their wedding photograph on the mantelpiece. He and a young, radiant Clara standing in this very hallway. And there, behind them, majestic and steadfast, stood the Howard Miller clock. Clara had been a practical woman, a librarian who believed in facts and tangible things. But she was also a woman of quiet depths, of hidden compartments in her heart and mind. She always had contingency plans, little secrets. You have to be prepared for winter, Richard, she used to say with a wry smile, even on the warmest days of July, even when you can't see it coming. Perhaps she had foreseen a winter he had been too blind to see, a winter that had finally, brutally arrived. The taxi dropped Richard at the edge of the North End, and he stepped out into a different Boston. The glass and steel canyons of the financial district gave way to a labyrinth of narrow, cobblestone streets that clung to the city's oldest bones. The air smelled of salt from the harbor and baking bread from the Italian pasticerias. It was a neighborhood of history, of substance, a place where stories seeped from the very brickwork. As he navigated the maze of streets, searching for the address Alistair Finch had given him, Richard felt a strange sense of coming home, a feeling he hadn't had in his own house for days. He found it on a quiet side street. Finch and Sons, Horology, a small, unassuming shop front with a large, intricate clock face hanging above the door. its hands frozen at 10:15. He pushed the door open and a small bell chimed, a delicate, pleasant sound. The world inside was a symphony of quiet industry. Dozens of clocks, from ornate mantelpieces to simple kitchen timers, ticked in a gentle, overlapping chorus. The air was thick with the clean, metallic scent of machine oil and wood polish. Gears, springs, and pendulums lay in neatly organized trays on workbenches, looking like the dissected skeletons of time itself. Behind the main counter, a man with a wild mane of white hair and a watchmaker's loop screwed into his eye looked up. "Mr. Finch?" he asked, his Scottish burr even richer in person. "Yes. Richard Finch. Alistair. A pleasure." He offered a hand that was surprisingly strong, his fingers calloused but steady. He gestured towards the back of the shop. "She's over here." And there it was, his clock. It stood in the corner, a silent, majestic giant amidst its smaller brethren. Seeing it again was a jolt, a pang of both grief and profound relief. It was like seeing a beloved family member in a hospital bed, out of place, but safe, intact. "She's a beauty," Alistair said, his voice full of reverence. "They don't make them with this kind of integrity anymore." He walked over to it, his movements precise and respectful. Now, for the matter at hand. Richard watched, his breath held tight in his chest, as Alistair produced a set of delicate, specialized tools from a leather roll. There was no fumbling, no hesitation. This was a man who spoke the language of mechanics and time. With the skill of a surgeon, he unhooked the great brass pendulum, its polished disc gleaming in the low light, and set it carefully aside. He then inserted a long, thin tool into what looked like a seamless piece of the clock's wooden interior. With a soft click, a section of the back panel sprang open, revealing a hidden cavity no bigger than a shoebox. "Clara was a clever woman," Alistair murmured, stepping back. Lead-lined. "To protect from moisture and time. Go ahead, sir. It's for you." Richard's hands trembled as he reached inside. His fingers brushed against cool, worn leather. He pulled out an old document box, the kind lawyers used to use. It was heavier than it looked. He carried it to Alistair's workbench and unfastened the tarnished brass clasps. Inside, everything was perfectly preserved. On top lay a sealed, cream-colored envelope with a single word written in his wife's elegant script. "Richard." Beneath it was a small, leather-bound diary and a thick file folder, neatly tied with a ribbon. Pandora's box. He picked up the envelope, his heart hammering against his ribs. He slid it open with a letter opener Alistair silently offered. The letter inside was several pages long, written on her favorite stationery. "My dearest Richard," the letter began. "If you are reading this, then the worst has happened. The clock is no longer in our home, and a part of our history has been sold away. I am so sorry you have to learn this from a letter, a voice from the past. For years I have carried a secret, a burden that I felt was mine alone to bear." Richard sank onto a stool as he read, the ticking of the surrounding clocks fading into a dull roar in his ears. Clara explained everything. The file, she wrote, contained documents detailing a land deal from 30 years ago, a deal between her father, a small-scale but honest property developer, and the Cabot family, Isabel's family. The Cabots, pillars of Beacon Hill society, had used their army of lawyers and their deep-rooted connections to exploit a loophole in the contract, bankrupting Clara's father and snapping up his properties for a pittance. It was all perfectly legal and utterly ruthless. The enclosed newspaper clipping from the Boston Globe told the sanitized public version. Local developer goes bust after controversial deal with Cabot family. She had only discovered the full, predatory extent of the story years after Thomas had started dating Isabel, piecing it together from her father's old papers. She had seen their son, so desperate to be a part of that world, being drawn into the orbit of the very family that had destroyed her own. He picked up the small diary and opened it. Clara's neat handwriting filled the pages. The last entry was from a Christmas party 2 years ago at the Cabot mansion. Isabel, after her third glass of champagne, turned to Thomas, speaking just loud enough for me to hear over the carols. "Your parents' house is so quaint," she'd said, the word dripping with condescension. "It's like a museum of dusty old things. Just like them. I can't wait until we can modernize things a little." The final page of the letter brought everything into sharp, brutal focus. She doesn't love him, Richard. She loves what he represents, a final victory over my family. An old name, an old house on Beacon Hill that her new money parents could never acquire. They don't see our home as a legacy, they see it as an asset to be stripped. That clock was the heart of our home, the keeper of our family's time. I knew that if they ever got their hands on it, it would be the first thing to go. I hid these papers inside it as an insurance policy. A final witness. Protect my father's memory. Protect our son from his own blind ambition. Don't let them win. The shock that had coursed through Richard morphed into a cold, diamond-hard anger. This wasn't just a thoughtless act of a greedy son. This was the final, triumphant move in a decades-long campaign of attrition. His son hadn't just sold a clock. He had been an unwitting pawn, delivering the final trophy to the enemy. Richard closed the box. It was heavy in his hands, heavy with secrets, with injustice. Clara hadn't just left a warning. She had left an indictment. And now, in the quiet ticking heart of a clockmaker's shop, it had become his duty to deliver it. Richard left Alistair Finch's shop not with the heavy heart of a grieving man, but with the cold, clear resolution of a general on the eve of battle. He carried Clara's leather box back to Beacon Hill, the weight of it no longer a burden but an anchor. The silence in his house was no longer an oppressive void. It was the quiet of a war room, a space for strategy and thought. His study, once a sanctuary for quiet contemplation, transformed into a command center. He cleared the large mahogany desk of its usual clutter of books and student papers. In their place, he laid out the contents of Clara's box, arranging the documents with the meticulous care of an archivist preparing an exhibit. The fraudulent land contract. Copies of legal correspondence between the Cabot and Clara's father's lawyers. The yellowed newspaper clipping. He placed Clara's diary at the center. Each piece was an artifact, a fragment of a hidden, ugly history. He analyzed them not as a wounded husband, but as a historian, tracing the timeline of deceit, identifying the key players, understanding the narrative of the crime. The next morning he made his first move. He met with Arthur Vance, the family's lawyer for over 30 years, a man with a mind as sharp as the crease in his trousers. In the hushed, book-lined conference room of Vance's firm downtown, Richard presented the evidence. He watched as the lawyer's expression shifted from polite sympathy to focused, professional outrage. "This is more than just a breach of contract, Richard," Vance said, his fingers steepled, his eyes glinting behind his spectacles. "This is a pattern of predatory behavior. Fraudulent conveyance, tortious interference. We can sue for the original financial damages, adjusted for inflation, plus punitive damages for the emotional distress caused to Clara's father, and by extension to Clara herself. We can target the entire Cabot family trust." He paused, tapping a pen on the thick file. "We can ruin them." "I don't just want to ruin them, Arthur," Richard said, his voice level and cold. "I want to deconstruct them, publicly." That afternoon, he made his second call. He met a former student, a bright, tenacious young woman named Maya Singh, who was now an investigative reporter for the Boston Globe, at a quiet corner table in the courtyard tea room of the Boston Public Library. He trusted her. He had taught her how to look past the official record and find the truth in the margins. He didn't show her the documents. Not yet. He simply baited the hook. "Maya," he began, stirring his tea, "I have a story for you. A big one. It's about one of Boston's most prominent families." He let that hang in the air. "I think you'll find that the foundation of their celebrated legacy is built on something rotten. I can't give you the details just yet, but I need you to be at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in 2 weeks for the annual Cabot Legacy Dinner. Bring a photographer. Trust me, there's going to be a story about the dark side of Boston's heritage, and you're going to be the one to break it." Her reporter's instincts lit up her eyes. She knew a good story when she heard one. She agreed without hesitation. The seeds of public disgrace had been sown. The final piece of his plan required him to do the hardest thing he had ever done, play the fool for his own son. He went home, sat in his study, took a deep breath to steady his nerves, and dialed Thomas's number. Thomas answered on the second ring, his voice wary. "Dad?" Richard let out a long, theatrical sigh, carefully crafting a tone of weary resignation. "Thomas," he began, his voice calm, slightly tired. "I've been doing a lot of thinking. About the clock. About everything. He paused, letting the silence stretch, forcing Thomas to fill it. And? Thomas asked, a hint of impatience in his voice. And you were right. It's just a thing. An old block of wood. I was overreacting. It's over. Richard had to fight back the bile that rose in his throat. I want to try, Thomas. I want to try to get along with Isabel's family. For your sake. He could almost hear the gears turning in his son's head, the relief, the dawning sense of victory. I heard about their upcoming legacy dinner, Richard continued, delivering the checkmate move. Would it be all right if I attended with you and Isabel? The relief in Thomas's voice was palpable, disgustingly so. It was mingled with a smug, patronizing tone that made Richard's hand clench the phone. Of course, Dad, that's a fantastic idea. Isabel will be so happy to hear you're finally ready to integrate, he said, unconsciously echoing her own cruel words from Clara's diary. You'll see. Her family is wonderful. They're pillars of this city. I'll let her know right away. This is great, Dad. Really great. Thomas's blithe ignorance, his eagerness to parade his broken father before his wife's family, made him the perfect, unsuspecting Trojan horse. Richard hung up the phone, his feigned weakness evaporating, replaced by a chilling sense of purpose. He looked around his study, at the shelves lined with books, chronicles of empires risen and fallen, of great men and their fatal flaws, of truths buried and later unearthed. History is not a passive collection of stories about the past. It is an arsenal, filled with precedents, strategies, and weapons. And he, a historian, knew exactly how to wield them to not only correct the record, but to reshape the future. The stage was set. The Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum wasn't just a building. It was a fantasy, an Italian palace, airlifted into the heart of Boston. Richard walked through the magnificent, glass-roofed courtyard, the air warm and fragrant with blooming orchids. Priceless works of art, Titians, Rembrandts, Botticellis, gazed down from the walls like silent, eternal witnesses. The Boston elite were out in full force, a glittering flock of tuxedos and designer gowns, their laughter echoing off the Venetian stonework. It was a perfect stage, a temple built to preserve beauty and truth, and tonight Richard would use it to exhume a long-buried, ugly history. Thomas and Isabel met him by the fountain. His son, looking relieved and handsome in his tuxedo, clapped him on the shoulder. Isabel, a vision in emerald silk, offered a brittle smile. "Richard, I'm so glad you decided to come," she said, her voice dripping with the magnanimity of a queen welcoming a difficult courtier. "It means so much to my family." "I wouldn't have missed it," Richard replied, his voice a placid sea beneath which cold currents moved. He spent the next hour nursing a single glass of sparkling water, a calm, observant ghost at the feast. He watched the Cabots work the room, their confidence as polished as their shoes. He listened to their self-congratulatory chatter, a symphony of hypocrisy, and felt a profound, almost serene contempt. They were celebrating a legacy, and he was here to read its obituary. Finally, the moment arrived. Mr. Cabot, Isabel's father, a man with a politician's smile and a predator's eyes, stepped up to a podium near the grand staircase. The warm yellow lights illuminated him, casting him as the benevolent patriarch. "The Cabot family is proud of its heritage," he began, his voice booming with false sincerity. "A legacy built on honesty, hard work, and an unwavering dedication to the great city of Boston. We believe in building things that last, in creating a foundation for future generations." The applause was polite and sustained. Richard watched Thomas, who was looking at his father-in-law with an expression of pure, unadulterated admiration. That, more than anything, solidified Richard's resolve. The MC then stepped forward. "And now, to say a few words, we are honored to have one of Boston's most respected academics, a man who has dedicated his life to the preservation of our city's history, Professor Richard Finch." A ripple of polite curiosity went through the crowd. Isabel preened, a flicker of triumph in her eyes. The difficult father-in-law was playing his part, adding his academic prestige to her family's glittering evening. Richard walked to the podium, his steps measured and even. He adjusted the microphone, his eyes scanning the crowd, finding Maya Singh near the back, and Arthur Vance, who gave a nearly imperceptible nod. "What an inspiring speech," Richard began, his voice calm and professorial, the familiar cadence of 1,000 lectures. The crowd settled, expecting a few dry but pleasant historical anecdotes. It reminded me of another chapter in the Cabot family's history, one not typically found in the society pages, but rather in the city's property archives. A subtle shift occurred in the room's atmosphere. The polite smiles became fixed. Mr. Cabot's posture stiffened. "It is a story from the autumn of 1993, Richard continued, his tone as objective as if he were discussing the Stamp Act. "It concerns a small but respected local developer and a parcel of land in Westwood. This developer, a man named Michael Albright, was by all accounts an honest man. He was also my wife Clara's father." A collective soft gasp rippled through the audience. Isabel went rigid, her wineglass frozen halfway to her lips. Richard laid out the story with the cold precision of a coroner. He detailed the complex legal clauses, the deliberately misleading correspondence, the final, devastating financial blow. He used no emotional language, offered no personal condemnation. He simply presented the facts, the history. The result, he concluded, was that the Cabot family acquired Mr. Albright's entire portfolio for 17 cents on the dollar, effectively bankrupting him. It was a masterclass in legal maneuvering, a legacy of a sort. As he spoke, the second wave of his attack deployed. Maya Singh's voice cut through the stunned silence. "Mr. Cabot, can you comment on the allegations of fraudulent conveyance in the 1993 Westwood deal?" A camera flashed, a small explosion of light that seemed to detonate the room's fragile composure. Simultaneously, Arthur Vance and 2 junior associates, who had been mingling with the guests, began to move. They discreetly handed slim, elegant folders to key figures in the crowd: bank presidents, university trustees, city council members. Inside each was a concise summary and copies of the most damning documents from Clara's box. The courtyard descended into chaos. The polite murmurings became a roar of shocked whispers and frantic conversation. Mr. Cabot stood, his face a mottled canvas of rage and shame, utterly speechless. Isabel stared at Richard, her mask of bored superiority shattered, revealing the raw panic beneath. Richard stepped down from the podium, his work done. He had not shouted, he had not accused, he had simply taught a lesson. The museum, a place for preserving history, had just witnessed a brutal act of historical correction. As the press swarmed the Cabots, Arthur Vance calmly approached the disgraced patriarch and served him with the official notice of a multi-million-dollar lawsuit. Through the maelstrom, Richard's eyes found Thomas. His son stood alone, stunned, amidst the wreckage of the evening. He was looking from his wife's horrified face to her father's apoplectic one, and then to his own father. The smug confidence was gone, replaced by the dawning, soul-crushing horror of a man who realizes the beautiful, glamorous world he has sold his soul for is nothing but a glittering fraud. Richard had won. Justice for Clara, for her father, had been served in the most public and devastating way imaginable. But as he looked at his son, standing broken and lost in the ruins of his life, Richard felt no triumph. The battle was over, but the war for his son's soul had only just begun. Richard took a taxi home. He didn't have the strength to navigate the late-night city streets. As he walked back into his house on Beacon Hill, the profound silence that had once tortured him now felt like a welcome, if somber, embrace. There was no sense of triumph, no thrill of victory, only the deep, bone-wearying exhaustion of a general after a long and brutal campaign. He didn't bother turning on the lights. He went to his study, sat in his worn leather armchair, and stared out at the gas lamps flickering on the silent cobblestones below. Sleep was an impossibility. He simply sat, the hours ticking by, a solitary figure in a quiet house, listening to the echoes of the chaos he had unleashed. The storm broke the next morning. It was on the front page of the Boston Globe, below the fold, but with a headline that was impossible to miss. Beacon Hill Brawl. Professor accuses Cabot family of historic fraud at Society Gala. Maya Singh had written a masterful piece, recounting Richard's history lecture in meticulous, damning detail. She quoted stunned attendees and included a sidebar on the long-forgotten story of Clara's father. By noon, the local news channels had picked it up, running clips of the panicked, chaotic exodus from the museum. The Cabot name was no longer a symbol of Boston Brahmin prestige. It was a byword for scandal. Just after lunch, Arthur Vance called. His voice was grimly professional. "Richard, my phone has been ringing off the hook all morning. The board members of the Gardner Museum, the Boston Symphony Orchestra, they're all convening emergency meetings. They're moving to have the Cabot name scrubbed from every plaque, program, and sponsorship deal. Their name in this city is finished." "And the lawsuit?" Richard asked, his voice flat. "They'll settle. They have no choice. They'll pay to make this go away as quietly as possible, but the social damage is done. Reputation is the only real currency in their world, and theirs is now worthless." There was a pause. "There's more, Richard. It's about Thomas." Richard closed his eyes. "Go on." "Isabel kicked him out of their Back Bay apartment this morning, threw his things out onto the curb. She's filed for divorce, citing irreparable emotional distress caused by his family. The irony is sickening." Vance sighed. "It gets worse. Thomas tried calling a few of his commercial real estate contacts, trying to salvage his business. One of them, a man he's known for years, told him straight to his face. He said, 'Listen, Tom, in this city money comes and goes, but a good name is everything. You married into the wrong family, and you made the wrong enemies. Don't call this number again.' The cold, pragmatic cruelty of it was breathtaking. Thomas wasn't just losing his wife. He was being surgically excised from the world he had sacrificed everything to join. The inevitable call came late that afternoon. Richard saw Thomas's name flash on the screen and steeled himself before answering. "Hello, Thomas." The voice on the other end was hollow, a dead, empty sound stripped of all its former arrogance. "They took everything," he whispered. "Isabel, the apartment, the accounts. My contacts won't even take my calls. Everything is gone." He took a ragged breath. "You won. You destroyed them. Are you happy now?" The question, laced with the bitter venom of the utterly defeated, landed without force. Richard felt a deep, aching pity for his son, but it was overshadowed by a sterner, colder resolve. He would not offer a lifeline. Not yet. "This was never about winning or losing, Thomas," Richard replied, his voice calm, steady, and devoid of paternal warmth. It was the voice of a professor addressing a student who had fundamentally missed the point of the lesson. "This was about the truth. For years, you chose to live in a world built on a lie because it was shiny and convenient. You traded your own history for a fabricated one. Now, the lie is gone, and you have to find your own way back to something real. So you're just going to leave me with nothing?" The disbelief in Thomas's voice was palpable. "You left yourself with nothing, Thomas. I am not your safety net this time. You must face the consequences of your choices. That is the only way you will ever learn their weight." He ended the call, his hand resting on the phone for a long moment. He felt like a doctor who had prescribed a painful, potentially dangerous course of treatment, knowing it was the only chance for a cure. Later that evening, he sat in his study, the Boston Globe with Maya's shocking article spread out on the desk before him. He had won. The historical record had been corrected with brutal, undeniable force. But a historian, more than anyone, knows that every revolution leaves casualties in its wake. And as he stared at the headline, he couldn't help but wonder if his own son was the first and most tragic victim of the revolution he had started. I guess 99% of you will hear this, sigh, and scroll past, not clicking like or subscribe, even if it only takes a second. What time is it for you, and where are you listening? The weeks that followed the explosion at the Gardner Museum were a new kind of silent. It was no longer the heavy, violated silence of a home that had lost its heart, but the vast, empty quiet of an aftermath. Richard fought a daily battle with himself, his hand hovering over the phone, his fatherly instincts screaming at him to find Thomas, to make sure he was safe, to offer him a roof over his head. But the historian in him, the man who understood that consequences were the bedrock of history, held him back. He had set the board. He had to let the pieces fall where they may. The news, when it came, was not from a frantic phone call or a lawyer's update, but from a chance encounter. He was having coffee with an old colleague, Philip, who sat on the board of the Boston Preservation Alliance. They were discussing funding for a new project when Philip mentioned it offhandedly. "It's a wonderful project, restoring the original pews at the Old North Church," Philip said, adding a lump of sugar to his espresso. We've even got a new apprentice in the workshop. A fellow named Hemmings, oddly enough. Complete career change. Used to be some high-flying real estate developer, from what I hear. Now he's learning the difference between cherry wood and pine. Richard froze, the coffee cup halfway to his lips. He managed a non-committal noise, his mind reeling. Thomas? In a carpentry shop? It seemed impossible. Thomas, who had once declared that anything older than a year was basically an antique, who saw value only in square footage and closing prices, was now working with his hands, with history, with the very substance he had so callously dismissed as a noisy block of wood. A few days later, a cold gray afternoon, Richard found himself drawn back to the North End. He didn't go to the church itself. He stood across the narrow cobblestone street, partially obscured by the awning of a bakery, an anonymous figure in a tweed overcoat. He could see into the brightly lit workshop through a large multi-paned window. And there he was. It was Thomas, but a version of him Richard barely recognized. The bespoke suit was gone, replaced by simple canvas work pants and a flannel shirt, a fine layer of sawdust dulling its colors. His hair was unkempt, his face was leaner, and his hands, Richard's eyes fixed on his son's hands. The ostentatious Swiss watch was gone. They were bare, smudged with wood stain, a small bandage wrapped around one thumb. They were the hands of a man who worked. Richard watched for nearly an hour as Thomas swept sawdust into a neat pile, listened intently to an older craftsman, and then set to work on a long piece of dark wood. He was sanding it, his movements slow, rhythmic, and intensely focused. There was a quiet deliberation in his posture, a peace that Richard had never seen in him, not even when he was celebrating the multi-million-dollar deals that had once been the measure of his life. This wasn't the frantic energy of ambition. It was the steady application of effort. He was learning a new language, the language of grain and texture, of patience and restoration. A profound, complex emotion washed over Richard, not just relief, but a flicker of respect. His son had not come crawling back. He had not sought an easy way out. He had, in his own way, sought penance. He had gone from the abstract world of finance and contracts to the most tangible thing imaginable, the careful, humble act of making something broken whole again. Richard turned and walked away without ever letting his son know he was there. He walked home through the Boston Common, the autumn leaves crunching under his feet. The ache in his chest, the constant, low-grade torment of a father at war with his son, had eased. For the first time, he felt a sliver of hope. Not that his son would come back to him, but that he would find a way back to himself. That evening he went into his study and made a call. "Alistair, it's Richard Finch." "Mr. Finch," the clockmaker's calm voice came down the line. "I was wondering when I might hear from you." "I'd like to buy the clock back," Richard said simply. "I'll have my bank wire the funds tomorrow. But I'm going to ask you to do me a favor. Don't deliver it. Just keep it in your shop for a while. I have a feeling it's waiting for a new repairman to finish his training." A week later, a single, plain white envelope arrived in the mail. It was not postmarked from a prestigious Back Bay address, but from the North End. Inside, on a single sheet of unadorned paper, were a few lines written in a simple, unpracticed script that was barely recognizable as his son's. There were no apologies, no excuses, no pleas for forgiveness, just one sentence. "I've started to pay back the debt to Grandpa. I thought you should know." Richard slowly folded the letter and placed it on his desk. He understood immediately. The debt wasn't financial. The Cabot settlement had taken care of that. The debt was one of honor, of history, of memory. And in that moment, Richard realized his son's journey wasn't about finding his way back to Beacon Hill. It was about finding his way back to the very roots he had tried so desperately to sever. It took Richard another 2 weeks to build up the courage for the next step. It was one thing to observe his son from a distance, a clandestine spectator to his penance. It was another thing entirely to cross the chasm that lay between them. He felt a profound hesitation, a fear that any move he made might shatter the fragile, nascent peace he had sensed in his son. He planned his approach with the meticulousness of a historian planning an excavation, knowing that the ground was unstable, the artifacts within priceless and easily broken. He chose a Friday evening, walking to the North End as the city was exhaling the working week. He stood outside the Old North Church workshop, waiting until the lights inside were switched off and the other craftsmen had left, their voices fading down the cobblestoned lane. A few moments later, Thomas emerged, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked tired, but it was the deep, satisfying weariness of physical labor, not the wired, hollow exhaustion Richard remembered from his son's previous life. Thomas saw him and stopped. The space between them, no more than 20 feet of worn brick sidewalk, felt as wide and cold as the Charles River in winter. A dozen emotions flickered across Thomas's face: surprise, shame, a flash of the old defensiveness, and then something quieter, more guarded. Richard's throat was dry. He had rehearsed a dozen openings, but they all evaporated in the crisp autumn air. He settled on the simplest. "Thomas," he said, his voice steadier than he expected, "I was hoping we could get some coffee." Thomas stared at him for a long moment, then gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. He seemed to have lost the currency of easy words. They walked in a stiff, formal silence, not toward the tourist-filled cafes of the North End, but across the bridge into Charlestown. Richard led them to a small, unpretentious cafe he knew, a place with worn wooden tables and large windows that overlooked the water. It was a carefully chosen vantage point. From their table, they could see the forest of masts from the historic ships docked at the Navy Yard on one side, and on the other, the gleaming steel and glass of new construction climbing into the sky. The intersection of old and new, of history and ambition, a fitting place for this conversation. They ordered, the mundane ritual of it a temporary shield against the weight of all that was unsaid. For several minutes they sat, stirring their coffees, the silence broken only by the clink of ceramic and the distant groan of a foghorn. It was Richard who finally spoke, his gaze fixed on his son's hands resting on the table. They were clean, but the calluses were visible, the knuckles scraped. "I saw you working the other day," he said quietly. "You looked content." Thomas gave a humorless shrug, a faint, tired smile touching his lips. He didn't seem surprised that his father had been watching. "I'm learning," he said, his voice low, a little rough. "It turns out that creating something with your hands is a lot harder than signing a check to have something destroyed. It's slow. You can't rush it." He ran a finger along a grain in the wooden table. "The master craftsman I work under, an old guy named Sal, he says every piece of wood has a story. You can see its life in the rings, the knots, the imperfections, where it struggled for light, where it was wounded and healed over. It's like what you were always trying to teach me, I guess. I just wasn't listening." Richard listened, not just to the words, but to the humility behind them. The old Thomas would have filled the silence with boasts or deflections. This Thomas was comfortable with the quiet, with the admission of ignorance. He was simply reporting the facts of his new reality. There was a profound and unexpected respect growing in Richard's chest. "You're learning an honorable trade," Richard said. It was the highest praise he could offer. Thomas looked up, his eyes meeting his father's for the first time. "I had to do something," he said. "Something real." This was the opening. Richard took a steadying breath. "Thomas, I bought the clock back." The color drained from Thomas's face. He looked down at his coffee cup as if the clock itself were a ghost that had just appeared in the room. "Why?" he whispered. "Because it is the heart of our house," Richard said simply. "And it does not belong in a stranger's shop. It is currently with Alistair Finch, the horologist, a master of his craft." Richard leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping, turning the conversation from a report into a proposal. "A test. I spoke with him. He knows the clock's mechanism, its history. He knows what needs to be done to restore the damage done by the move, to recalibrate its soul." He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle between them. "Alistair has agreed to take on an apprentice for one specific project. He will guide you. He will teach you what you need to know about the gears, the weights, the chime. But you will do the work. You will be the one to repair it. You will bring the heart home, Thomas, with your own two hands." The proposition hung in the air, immense and terrifying. Richard was not offering forgiveness. He was offering a sacrament of labor, a path to redemption so steep and difficult it was almost cruel. He was asking his son to physically rebuild the symbol of the very heritage he had desecrated. Thomas was stunned into silence. He looked from his father's face to the window, and then down at his own hands, spreading them on the table as if seeing them for the first time. These hands had signed away his history. Could they possibly be the same hands to restore it? The responsibility was crushing, a weight far heavier than any ancient church pew. I can't, he finally stammered, shaking his head. I'm a novice. I sweep floors. I sand wood. I don't know anything about horology, about the fine mechanics. It's too important. I would ruin it. Richard reached across the table, his hand hovering for a moment before resting gently on his son's shoulder. The first time he had touched him in months. Every great journey begins with a single, uncertain step, Thomas, Richard said, his voice firm but not unkind. Alistair will not let you fail. The question is not whether you can do it. The question is whether you dare to try. The first day Thomas walked into Alistair Finch's shop as an apprentice felt like stepping into a foreign country where he didn't speak the language. The air, thick with the scent of brass, oil, and old wood, was a world away from the sterile glass towers he once inhabited. The gentle, chaotic symphony of dozens of ticking clocks was unsettling, each one marking a second he felt he had wasted in his life. Alistair, a figure of quiet authority in his leather apron, greeted him not with a handshake, but with a simple, practical instruction. We'll start with the case, the old horologist said, his Scottish burr making the words sound like carved stone. Before you can understand the heart, you must learn to respect the body. Richard was there, too. He didn't hover or instruct. He sat on a stool in the corner, ostensibly reading a book on Renaissance art, but Thomas knew he was watching. His presence was a quiet, immense pressure. For the first week, Thomas did nothing but learn how to care for the wood. Under Alistair's patient tutelage, he learned the art of cleaning and reviving the magnificent cherry wood case. He learned how to mix a special blend of beeswax and lemon oil, how to apply it with a soft cloth, moving in slow, circular motions that followed the wood's natural grain. His hands, which had once signed million-dollar contracts with a flourish, now learned a new, more intimate form of value. He discovered the tiny nicks and scratches that marked the clock's long life, a faint scar near the base where he'd crashed his toy truck as a boy, a small, dark ring on the side where his mother once rested a sweating glass of iced tea on a hot July afternoon. Your mother chose this clock, you know, Richard said one afternoon, his voice soft, breaking a long, comfortable silence. He had put his book down. We were at an estate auction in the Berkshires. I was looking at a more ornate mahogany one, but Clara... She walked right up to this one. She ran her hand down the side, just like you're doing now. She said, "This one has a kinder face, Richard, and it sounds like it's telling the truth." Thomas stopped his polishing, his hand resting on the warm wood. He could almost feel the echo of his mother's touch. He said nothing, simply nodded and continued his work, the memory now a part of the grain he was so carefully tending. After 2 weeks, Alistair deemed him ready to look inside. The large front panel was removed, and Thomas stared for the first time at the intricate, mystifying world of gears, cables, and weights. It was a brass city of interconnected destinies, a mechanical universe where every piece had a purpose. "This is not a machine of brute force," Alistair explained, pointing with a thin brass rod. "It is a machine of patience. Each gear turns at its own speed, in its own time. The goal is not to force them, but to understand their relationship, to persuade them to work together." Richard would often add the historical context. "Howard Miller started as a furniture company, you know," he'd offer, joining them at the workbench. They only began making these grand clocks after learning from the German masters. This model, the Statesman, was built in a time when people believed in permanence. They bought a clock not for a decade, but for their grandchildren. Ugh! The work was painstaking. Thomas's large hands, accustomed to the broad strokes of a real estate deal, struggled with the microscopic screws and delicate springs. One afternoon, a tiny but crucial brass screw slipped from his tweezers, falling into the complex forest of the mechanism. Panic seized him. He had broken it, irrevocably. "Breathe, lad," Alistair said calmly, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder. "We don't panic. We listen. We look. We find." For the next hour, the three of them, the old master, the historian, and the apprentice, huddled over the clock with a small magnet and a penlight, a silent, focused team. It was Richard who finally spotted it, wedged beside the chime hammer. Thomas's sigh of relief was so profound it seemed to stir the dust motes dancing in the afternoon Sunday. The most difficult and most anticipated part was the chimes. The series of long, resonant rods had been slightly jarred in the move. Alistair showed Thomas how to test each one, to gently adjust the felt on the hammers, to listen not just with his ears but with his fingertips for the right vibration. Finally, the moment came. They had reassembled the primary mechanism. Alistair nodded to Thomas, who reached in and carefully gave the weighted pendulum its first push. The shop fell silent, the ticking of the other clocks seeming to hold their breath. The steady, familiar tick-tock began, a slow, deep, resonant sound. It was the house breathing. It was the sound of his childhood. They waited. As the long minute hand crept towards the 12, Richard stood up, his book forgotten. The whirring of the gears was a soft prelude, and then, for the first time in months, the first clear, bell-like tone of the Westminster quarters rang out. It was perfect, pure, true. Richard closed his eyes, a faint, sad smile on his face. "Your mother used to hum along with it," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "especially when she was in the kitchen. She was often a little off-key, but the clock never seemed to mind." Thomas looked at the complex, beautiful machine he had helped bring back to life. He had sold it for a fleeting, fashionable trip to Paris, a handful of oysters. He had traded this symphony of memory and craftsmanship for a silence he couldn't bear. The depth of his foolishness washed over him, but for the first time, it was not followed by the sting of shame, but by the quiet, solid feeling of atonement. He spent another week finishing the final adjustments, calibrating the pendulum, and giving the case one last polish, until it glowed with a deep, inner light. One Saturday morning, he put the last tool down. He ran his hand over the smooth, curved hood. It was done. He turned to his father, who was watching him from his now familiar stool. "It's ready, Dad." Richard looked from his son's face, smudged with oil but clear-eyed and calm, to the magnificent clock, ticking steadily, waiting. He stood up and placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder, his grip firm. "Then let's take it home. I guess 99% of you will hear this." Sigh and scroll past, not clicking. "Like or subscribe, even if it only takes a second. What time is it for you, and where are you listening?" The day the clock came home was a day of quiet, reverent ceremony. A simple panel truck, driven by Alistair himself with Thomas riding shotgun, pulled up on the narrow Beacon Hill street. There were no commercial movers this time, no careless hands. There was only the master, the apprentice, and the historian. Bringing it in was a slow, careful dance. It was Thomas who took charge, his voice low but confident as he directed the delicate process. "Easy on the left, Dad. Watch the door frame. Alistair, can you check the clearance at the base?" He moved with a newfound physical grace, his body attuned to the clock's weight and fragility. He was no longer a man who ordered things done, but a man who did them, who understood the mechanics of the task from the inside out. Richard watched, a lump forming in his throat, and did as he was told. He was not the general anymore. He was a willing soldier in his son's campaign of restoration. They maneuvered the tall cherrywood case into the upstairs hallway. It felt like a king returning to his throne. With a final, coordinated effort, they settled it into its rightful place. The 4 feet landed with a soft, definitive thud, fitting perfectly into the faint indentations on the hardwood floor that had been like empty footprints for months. The clock's back rested flush against the wall, completely covering the pale, ghostly rectangle of wallpaper. The scar was gone. The house, visually at least, was whole again. Alistair performed a final inspection, checking the level, ensuring everything was stable. Then he clapped Thomas on the shoulder. "She's your patient now, lad," he said, his work as a mentor complete. He gave a respectful nod to Richard and saw himself out, leaving father and son alone with the silent sentinel. For a long moment they just stood there, looking at it. It was an object of profound beauty, glowing with a deep, renewed luster under the hallway light, but it was still just an object. A body without a soul. "It needs to acclimate to the house for an hour before we start the pendulum," Thomas said, his voice sounding technical, professional. It was a way to manage the immensity of the moment. They spent the hour in the kitchen, making tea, the conversation stilted and mundane, both of them acutely aware of the silent clock upstairs, waiting. Finally, Thomas looked at his watch. "It's time." They walked back up the stairs together. Thomas opened the long glass door of the clock face. the familiar click of the latch echoing in the stillness. He reached inside, his hands, now calloused and capable, moving with a surgeon's precision. He hooked the heavy brass weights onto their cables and gently attached the great gleaming pendulum to its suspension spring. He checked everything one last time, his breath held in concentration. Then he stepped back. He looked at his father, his expression a complex mixture of fear and resolve. "Dad," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "you should do it." Richard looked at his son, this new man, humbled and remade by the patient lessons of wood and time. He saw the offering for what it was, a final act of deference, a handing back of a legacy Thomas felt he had no right to claim. And in that moment Richard knew what he had to do. "No, Thomas," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You brought it home. You brought its voice back. You must be the one to let it speak." Thomas stared at his father, and in Richard's eyes he saw not a test, but a transfer of trust, a gift. He took a deep, steadying breath, turned back to the clock, and reached inside. He drew the heavy brass disc of the pendulum to one side, holding the potential energy of the house in his hand. He held it for a heartbeat, a silent prayer, and then he released it. The first swing was silent, a sweeping arc of polished brass. And then came the sound. Tick. It was a small sound, but it landed in the silent house like a stone in a still pond. Tock. The sound of life. The steady, comforting, rhythmic pulse that had been absent for so long. It was the house breathing again. Richard felt tears well in his eyes. Thomas stood transfixed, his hands still inside the case, as if he were feeling the pulse directly. They stood side by side, father and son, for a full 5 minutes, saying nothing, simply listening to that simple, miraculous sound filling the empty spaces of the house and the silence that had grown between them. It was a sound of forgiveness, a sound of homecoming. The long minute hand crept slowly toward the 12. As it approached, the familiar preparatory whirring began deep within the clock's chest, a sound of gathering breath. Thomas slowly withdrew his hand and closed the glass door, the soft click sealing the moment. And then it came, the first clear, perfect note of the Westminster quarters. It sang out in the hallway, the sound richer and warmer than Richard had ever remembered. The chimes rolled through the house, washing over the ghosts of anger and betrayal, announcing not just the hour but a new era. The final, deep, sonorous bong of the hour faded, leaving the steady, peaceful ticking in its wake. The heart was beating again. Thomas finally looked at his father, his eyes shining. There were no grand apologies, no dramatic declarations. There didn't need to be. The clock said everything. Richard put his arm around his son's shoulders, and together they stood in the hallway, two men bound by a shared, complicated history, listening. They were listening to the heartbeat of their home, a heartbeat that had stopped and was now, through patience, humility, and love, beating strong once more.